The air in Boston, 1879, was a perpetual cocktail of sea salt and coal smoke, a fitting atmosphere for a city where the veneer of progress concealed the grit of its unforgiving moral landscape. On Beacon Hill, where the gas lamps cast long, judging shadows, Elias Thornwood stood on the polished granite steps of his townhouse. A gust of wind, sharp and biting like a whispered slander, whipped the tail of his austere black frock coat. Beside him stood his daughter, Ilara. Ilara was 21, a woman whose mere existence was, in her father's eyes and the view of their devout community, a constant source of mortification. She was not merely stout, by the standards of the time, and especially the punishing standards of the Calvary Covenant Church. She was excessive, a walking testament to an unforgivable lack of discipline. Her father, a man whose entire life was a monument to rigorous self-control and high moral standing within the church, saw her weight as a stain on the Thornwood name, a visible, fleshy manifestation of spiritual sloth. The church elders called it a burden of the soul, a physical impurity that required purification. Elias adjusted his spectacles, his eyes, cold blue chips of judgment, resting on her. He did not look at her face, only at the bulk of her form swaddled in a heavy, unflattering serge dress. "You will show respect and humility, Ilara," he intoned, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that rarely elevated above a disapproving murmur. "You are being given a chance at salvation, a path to shed this affliction." Ilara didn't respond. She merely clutched the brass locket hidden beneath her collar, her knuckles white. Inside it was a faded tintype of her mother, a woman who had died 2 years prior, a woman who had loved her without condition, and whose absence had been the catalyst for Ilara's rapid, comfort-seeking weight gain, a grief her father had pathologized as gluttony. Her silence was not rebellion, but exhaustion. She was tired of the relentless, microscopic scrutiny that had been her inheritance since the day her mother was buried under a fresh blanket of New England snow. A carriage, dark and unadorned, pulled up to the curb. It was driven by Silas, a grim, silent man who served the church elders. He wore a severe, high-collared coat, and his gaze was unsettlingly blank. The destination was a place rarely spoken of above a whisper. The Ebenezer Sanctuary, a sprawling, secluded property in the rural outskirts of Brookline, owned entirely by the Calvary Covenant Church and ostensibly dedicated to the care of the morally strayed. Elias placed a heavy, unforgiving hand on her shoulder. "The elders are waiting. They have secured the finest minds for your rehabilitation. You will submit to their counsel, Ilara. You will atone for this indulgence." As she boarded the carriage, she glanced back at her home. A place that was already a prison, now merely exchanging its 4 familiar walls for 4 unfamiliar ones. The street was quiet, the gaslight flickering. She could see the silhouettes of neighbors peering from behind lace curtains, the silent, ever-present jury of Boston society. The carriage jolted forward, pulling her away from the respectable heart of the city and into the muddy, unlit roads of the periphery. Inside, the oppressive silence was broken only by the rhythmic clatter of the horse's hooves and the anxious, shallow sound of her own breathing. Ilara ran her fingers over a small, crude scar just above her elbow, a memento of a childhood accident, and a faint tremor of fear, cold and liquid, ran down her spine. The church's definition of rehabilitation was a concept shrouded in ambiguity and fear. They preached sacrifice, but their methods of enforcing it were notoriously unconventional and secretive. Hours passed. The urban sprawl gave way to dense, leafless winter woods. Finally, the carriage turned down a long, private drive, ending at a massive 3-story stone structure. It looked less like a sanctuary and more like a sanatorium, cold and isolated. The windows were few, and those that existed were tall, narrow slits, like accusing eyes. Waiting on the steps were Elder Thomas, and Elder Davies, the two most influential men in the Calvary Covenant Church besides her father. Elder Thomas was thin to the point of emaciation, his features sharp, his eyes conveying a chilling certainty of his own moral superiority. Elder Davies was stouter, a man whose soft exterior concealed a deeply unsettling, calculating intelligence. "Welcome, daughter Ilara," Elder Thomas said, his voice smooth and unnervingly calm. "You are home. You have been chosen for a special private work." The word chosen felt like a brand, not a blessing. Ilara looked past them, into the dark, echoing foyer. The air within the Ebenezer sanctuary was stale, heavy with the scent of old wood, disinfectant and something else. Something metallic like cold, dried blood, or perhaps just the deep, cold dampness of the stone itself. Elder Davies stepped forward, his eyes lingering on her size for a fraction too long. "Your father has entrusted us with your purification. You see, Ilara, the body is a temple and a cage. We must ensure that the spirit is not smothered by the flesh." He smiled, but it was a smile that didn't reach his eyes. It was the kind of smile one might give to a difficult object about to be dismantled. Ilara felt the full, terrifying weight of their combined scrutiny. This was not a place for spiritual guidance. This was a place for control. They didn't want her to lose weight for her health or happiness. They wanted to erase the part of her that defied their rigid order. As she was led inside, the heavy oak door slamming shut behind her with a sound that echoed like a final, absolute sentence, a crucial detail snagged her attention. On a small wooden side table near the main staircase next to a ledger lay a set of objects. A stethoscope, a small worn leather case, and a series of meticulously sharpened surgical tools. Tools of medicine, but wielded by men of God. The chilling realization was immediate. The affliction they spoke of was not merely her diet, and the rehabilitation would not be confined to prayer. Her fear solidified into a paralyzing dread, a raw, elemental terror of what these men, operating outside the constraints of law and decency, planned to do to her body. Her personal nightmare had just begun. If you want to witness Ilara's terrifying journey through the Ebenezer sanctuary and uncover the dark secret of the church elders, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. The first 24 hours in the Ebenezer sanctuary were a study in sterile dread. Ilara was confined to a small Spartan room on the second floor. The walls were whitewashed, the single window barred, and the furniture consisted only of an iron cot, a wooden chest, and a basin. There were no mirrors, a detail Ilara immediately recognized as deliberate. The elders wanted to strip her of any self-perception, replacing it with theirs. The atmosphere of the sanctuary was defined by a pervasive, unnerving silence. Footfalls were muffled, voices were never raised, and the only persistent sound was the groan of the old house settling in the frigid night, a sound like a distant sigh of resignation. This silence was not peaceful. It was a tool of psychological control, amplifying every anxious thought in Ilara's mind. On the morning of the second day, Elder Thomas arrived to escort her. He wore a crisp, clean vestment, a stark contrast to the dim hallway. "Come, daughter Ilara," he commanded, his tone devoid of warmth. "It is time to begin your redemption." He led her down a flight of creaking, narrow stairs to the rear wing of the building, a section that felt colder and smelled more strongly of the metallic scent she'd noticed earlier. He opened a heavy, unmarked door, revealing a room that resembled a blend of a monastic cell and a primitive infirmary. This was the Chamber of Silence. The room was large, dominated by a long wooden table, similar to an operating table with thick leather straps attached to its sides. Against one wall were shelves lined with unlabeled bottles, glass jars containing unidentified liquids, and several meticulously organized gleaming metal instruments. This was where the treatment took place. Elder Davies was already inside, meticulously wiping down one of the tools, a thin, curved scalpel, with an alcohol-soaked cloth. He looked up, his smile unsettlingly paternal. Ah, Ilara, we are a house of God, but also a house of science. We understand that the spirit cannot be saved unless the vessel is purged. Purged of what, Elder? Ilara managed to ask, her voice brittle. Elder Thomas approached her, his lean frame intimidating. Of the sins that have manifested in your flesh, child. We believe that your condition, your excess, is caused by an imbalance, a blockage, not merely of the appetite, but of the vital energies of the body. He gestured to the table. You will lie here. We begin with hydrotherapy. Hydrotherapy, in the context of 1879 medicine, was often rudimentary and brutal. They stripped her down to a thin cotton shift. The shame of her exposed body was overwhelming, her distress a powerful psychological assault. The elders, however, maintained an air of chilling clinical detachment, treating her with the impersonal efficiency of men handling a machine in need of repair. For the next hour, they subjected her to alternating streams of hot and then shockingly cold water, administered through a crude, hand-pumped device, focusing the jets primarily on her abdomen and legs. The shock of the cold water was painful, leaving her gasping. This cleanses the humors, Elder Davies explained, his voice a monotonous chant over the splashing water. It stirs the sluggish metabolism and forces the body to reignite its purifying fire. The physical discomfort was immense, but the psychological element was worse, the sheer violation of her personal space, the humiliation of being naked and helpless before these two judgmental men, was a profound terror. They were not merely treating a physical condition. They were establishing absolute dominance over her body and will. Later, they moved to the nutritional aspect of the treatment. Her meals consisted of small bowls of a thin, watery broth, and sometimes a single slice of dry bread. Isolation and starvation became her daily routine, a deprivation that was psychologically draining, leaving her mind clouded and her body weak. The elders began their evening council, long, intense sessions of reading scripture and pointed sermons about the sin of gluttony and the necessity of sacrifice. They never addressed her by name, only as daughter, a generic term that reinforced her lack of identity within the sanctuary's walls. One evening, as the elders were examining her, Elder Thomas held a brass caliper, a tool for measuring, and pressed it firmly into the flesh of her arm. The resistance remains stubborn, Elder Davies, he murmured, sounding disappointed. The spirit has been starved, yet the flesh clings to its indiscipline. Elder Davies responded with a chilling pragmatism. We must accelerate the process, Thomas. The old methods were designed to be gradual. We lack the luxury of time. The investigation begins in a fortnight. Ilara's head snapped up. Investigation? What investigation? The two elders exchanged a look, a quick, almost invisible flash of conspiracy. Elder Thomas fixed her with his cold gaze. A private matter of the church, daughter. Nothing that concerns a patient under treatment. You simply need to be ready when the time comes. The ambiguity was a psychological wedge. Ready for what? The elders' conversations were always cryptic, dropping just enough information to foster anxiety and confusion. As the days turned into a week, Ilara began to notice subtle, disturbing details about the sanctuary and her treatment that intensified the mystery. The elders, who claimed to be purging her sins through starvation and hydrotherapy, seemed to possess an unnatural, almost obsessive knowledge of the body's internal workings, beyond what a layman minister of the 1870s should possess. She noticed a peculiar tattoo on Elder Davies's inner wrist, a faint circular mark that looked like a crude amateur etching of a spiral. She also began to find small, almost invisible pinpricks on her skin in the mornings, especially on her legs and the back of her hands, almost as if she had been examined while she slept. Her anxiety mounted. They were not just starving her, they were observing her in ways that were increasingly invasive and medically suspicious. The elders were not simply preachers, they were performing a secret, unlicensed experiment, and Ilara was the subject. The horrifying question was, what was the true goal of their experiment, and what was the body supposed to yield? The pinpricks continued. Tiny, precise, and impossible to locate while awake, they were a chilling signature left behind by the elders' nocturnal activities. Ilara began to sleep fitfully, her mind a frantic loop of terror and fatigue, the lack of food compounding her mental distress. She knew they were examining her, perhaps even extracting something, but the absolute secrecy of the sanctuary prevented any confirmation. One afternoon, while Elder Davies was called away to receive a delivery, a heavy, crated box that was carried into the rear wing with extreme caution, Ilara seized her opportunity. Elder Thomas was in his office preparing the weekly sermon, a room across the hall from the Chamber of Silence, where the main ledger was kept. Using the small brass pin from her mother's locket, a desperate, clumsy act, Ilara managed to pick the primitive lock on the chamber door. The silence inside was thick and heavy. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the stillness. She raced to the wooden chest where she had seen Elder Davies often write. Inside, wrapped in a thick, oiled cloth, was the Ebenezer ledger. The moment her fingers touched the coarse paper, a wave of profound guilt and adrenaline washed over her. The ledger was written in a precise, spidery hand, a mixture of biblical references and cold, clinical terminology. Most entries were indecipherable to her, a long list of measurements, dates, and dosages of various tinctures. But 3 entries, written in ink that was clearly older, jumped out. The first was a woman's name, Lydia A. Burden, 1874. Commencement of process, hypnosis and dietary restriction. Result, loss of 60 lebes. Spirit restored. Current whereabouts, unknown. The second, Martha C. Affliction, 1877. Progress, 40 lebes lost. Refusal to yield. Recommended, increase of nightly sample. Eventual result, cessation of life functions. Cause of death, rapid wasting sickness. The third, dated 2 months prior, made Ilara's blood run cold. It was a name she knew. Sarah T., Sister of the Faithful. Given to the elders for purification. Body did not respond to initial stimulus. Requires stronger course. Sarah T. was a quiet, modest woman from the congregation who had disappeared suddenly, her absence explained only by a vague, whispered mention of a family matter requiring distance. But the most disturbing part was not the deaths, which confirmed her deepest fears about the ruthlessness of the elders' treatment. It was the precise, repeated mention of nightly sample and stimulus alongside her own name, which was entered on the following page. It read, Ilara T. Father's Gift, 1879. Commencement, psychological conditioning and starvation. Notes, responds poorly to dietary restriction alone. Next step, introduction of the waking lullaby. Ilara frantically turned a few more pages. The elders were clearly part of something bigger than 2 men seeking to enforce piety. There were notations referring to a consortium of saints and the Harvest Fund. This was not just a secluded mission, it was a clandestine operation with financial motives. Just as she heard the distant grinding sound of the outside door closing, Elder Davies' return, she saw a single loose sheet of paper tucked deep inside the ledger. It was a crude drawing, an anatomical diagram of a human body with several circles drawn over specific areas, the abdomen, the thighs, and the breasts, and each circle was labeled with a single, chilling word, deposit. She barely had time to slide the paper back, close the ledger, and relock the door before Elder Davies's heavy steps echoed in the hall. She was shaking, her heart in her throat, her mind reeling from the cold, clinical assessment of human life and death recorded in that book. That evening, the elders began the waking lullaby. After her meager supper, Elder Thomas administered a small dose of a clear, bitter liquid, claiming it was a calming, herbal tonic. It wasn't. Soon Ilara felt a profound sense of heavy fatigue, but her mind remained terrifyingly lucid. She lay on her cot, unable to move, trapped inside her own body. Then, from the adjacent room, the Chamber of Silence, a low rhythmic sound began. A series of short, high-pitched pulses, almost inaudible, like the mechanical thrumming of a distant, hidden engine. It was a sound designed to bypass conscious hearing and assault the mind directly. Elder Davies entered her room, holding a small battery-operated device, a new, rudimentary invention of the burgeoning electrical age. He sat beside her, his face inches from hers. "This is the lullaby, Ilara," he whispered, his voice dangerously soft. "It will relax the flesh, release the mind. Tonight the sample will be taken with greater ease, and soon the deposits will be ready for the harvest." The sight of the apparatus, combined with the paralyzing effect of the tonic, sent Ilara into a spiral of terror. Her body was a prison, and the elders were now inserting a key into the lock of her consciousness. They were not just starving her to lose weight, they were harvesting something from her, something they had identified in her body's excess, using the veneer of religious cleansing to conceal a ruthless, medically oriented extraction. The surgical tools, the crude diagrams, the cryptic notations, it all pointed to a terrible truth. They were not trying to save her soul. They were mining her body for a resource. But what could be so valuable in the body of a sinful woman in 1879 to warrant such horrific measures? The waking lullaby became a nightly torment. The low, insistent thrumming from the adjacent room was a constant oral reminder that they possessed absolute control over her. The paralyzing tonic ensured she was conscious for the nightly samples, forcing her into a state of powerless observation. The elders no longer attempted to maintain the facade of spiritual counseling during these nocturnal sessions. They were purely clinical. They would wheel in a cart, a crude contraption covered by a white sheet, and begin the process. Under the harsh, focused beam of a primitive oil lamp, Elder Davies, wearing thin leather gloves, would use a long, thin needle, far longer than any medical syringe Ilara had ever seen, to make one of the tiny pinpricks she had been finding. They focused exclusively on areas of high fat concentration. The soft tissue of her hips, the upper swell of her thighs, the deepest part of her abdomen. Ilara couldn't scream, couldn't move, but her eyes, wide with sheer, abject horror, followed every move. Elder Thomas would assist, adjusting the lamp, monitoring a small, ticking stopwatch. After the extraction, they would place the contents of the syringe into a series of small, corked glass vials, each one labeled with a number that corresponded to the ledger. "Excellent yield tonight, Thomas," Elder Davies would murmur, his voice heavy with professional satisfaction, not spiritual zeal. The lullaby truly optimizes the deposit. The warmth of the room is aiding in liquefaction. "The harvest is coming, brother," Elder Thomas would reply, his voice flat. "We must prepare the straining apparatus. This latest batch must be purified before the consortium arrives." The terminology was a bizarre, chilling fusion of agriculture, finance, and medicine. Yield, deposit, liquefaction, straining apparatus, harvest, and consortium. The elders viewed her body, and the bodies of the other women mentioned in the ledger, as a living, renewable resource. Their excess not a sin to be purged, but an asset to be exploited. Driven by a desperate need to understand her terrifying situation, Ilara focused her lucid, trapped mind on the elders' movements. She noticed that the substance extracted was a thick, yellowish liquid, clearly a form of fat, but it was being treated with a level of care and precision that defied any logic she could conceive. Why would anyone go to such elaborate, secretive, and dangerous lengths to procure human fat? Lard was easily obtained. During the day, the psychological conditioning intensified. The elders brought in a book of medical diagrams, a terrifying book of anatomy and archaic surgical illustrations. They would force Ilara to study the plates, pointing out the areas of her body that were diseased or sinful, using her own weight against her. "This is the adipose layer, Ilara," Elder Davies explained, tapping a drawing with a thin, bony finger. "A storehouse of sin, an affront to efficiency. We are merely draining the pool of iniquity." Ilara realized that the elders had identified a valuable element within human fat, a rare component that was perhaps easier to harvest from a large body, or perhaps only present in large volumes in a body that had rapidly gained weight due to stress or other factors. The key was to find out what that element was. She managed to whisper a plea to Elder Thomas during a moment when Elder Davies was out of the room. "Why? Why are you doing this?" "What is the harvest?" Elder Thomas paused, his eyes flickering with an emotion Ilara couldn't place. Perhaps pity, perhaps a cold, fleeting pang of conscience. He leaned in, his voice barely audible above the relentless clanging of the steam radiator outside. "It is the future, child. The oil that burns brighter than the whales, the grease that allows the new century to turn. It is the catalyst." He straightened up just as Elder Davies returned, his expression instantly reverting to a mask of severe piety. The exchange was over, but the clue was profound. Oil that burns brighter, a catalyst. In 1879, the race for efficient fuel and industrial lubricants was paramount. Could they be extracting a rare form of human-derived biofuel or industrial oil? The sanctuary, the religious facade, the psychological torment, it was all an incredibly elaborate, ruthless system for industrial-scale human harvesting. The sin of gluttony was the elders' justification, and her body was their mine. The terror was no longer supernatural. It was industrial, inhumanely pragmatic, and deeply rooted in the Gilded Age's ruthless pursuit of profit and efficiency. The next morning, Ilara found a message scratched into the whitewashed wall of her room, hidden low behind the iron cot. It was faint, almost invisible, but clearly the work of a previous occupant. "They use the fat for the new light. Do not drink the green tea." Ilara froze. The calming herbal tonic Elder Thomas gave her nightly was a thin, pale green tea. She had been drinking the substance that paralyzed her, the substance that prepared her body for the harvest. Her hope for rescue was now entirely contingent on her ability to resist the poison that had already compromised her will. The anonymous warning scratched into the wall, "Do not drink the green tea," was the crucial piece of information Ilara needed. It confirmed that the elders' treatment was a calculated chemical process, and that the paralyzing agent, which they falsely claimed was an herbal tonic, was administered orally. The realization injected a fierce, cold surge of resistance into Ilara's otherwise depleted body. Her fear was now channeled into a singular, desperate act of defiance. She was no longer a passive victim. She was a participant in her own survival. Her opportunity came that evening. Elder Thomas brought in her meager supper and the small, steaming porcelain cup of the so-called calming tonic. He set it down with his usual air of detached formality. "Drink it all, daughter. It will calm the anxieties of the flesh." Ilara sat at the edge of her cot, her hands trembling. She looked into the murky, green liquid. The first instinct was to simply refuse, but she knew that would lead to immediate physical force and a far more brutal administration of the tonic. She had to maintain the pretense of submission. As Elder Thomas turned to adjust the oil lamp, a necessary movement in the dimly lit room, Ilara executed her plan. She had practiced the motion mentally for hours. With a quick, desperate movement of her wrist, she flicked the contents of the cup, mostly, into the chamber pot under the bed, simultaneously raising the empty cup to her lips and making a loud, theatrical swallowing sound. A small splash of the bitter liquid hit her tongue, but the bulk was gone. Elder Thomas turned back, satisfied. "Good. Now, rest." He left, locking the heavy door with a decisive thud. Ilara lay on the cot, waiting. The difference was immediate and profound. Though still physically weak from starvation, her mind was clear, and most importantly, she still possessed the power of movement. The terrifying, paralyzing paralysis was absent. The low, rhythmic thrumming of the waking lullaby began almost immediately from the chamber of silence next door. It was an assault, a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to penetrate the bone. She recognized the chilling, mechanical sound. The elders were already preparing the harvesting apparatus. Ilara carefully rolled off the cot and pressed her ear to the wall separating her room from the chamber of silence. The wall was thin, constructed of plaster and lath rather than the heavy stone of the exterior. She could hear the muffled, dispassionate voices of the elders. They were speaking about the final stage, the purification of the deposits. "The consortium arrives on Thursday, Davies." Elder Thomas's voice was clear. "We must have the initial batch filtered by then. The color is still too turbid." "It is the stubborn nature of the host, Thomas," Elder Davies replied with a slight sigh of impatience. "The higher the yield, the more impurities. We must increase the temperature of the straining liquid. And we must be careful with Ilara. Her father will be watching." The reference to her father, Elias Thornwood, as an external threat rather than an accomplice, was a crucial detail. Elias had given them his daughter, but he clearly did not know the full, horrific extent of their process, merely believing he was subjecting her to a rigorous spiritual and dietary regimen. Ilara knew she had only a matter of minutes before they entered her room for the nightly sampling. She had to find a weapon, or at least a tool for escape, and she had to learn exactly what they were extracting and how. She pulled the wooden chest over to the barred window. The bars were iron, cemented firmly into the stone. Escape through the window was impossible. Her fingers grazed the rough, unvarnished wood of the chest. It was a sturdy, heavy piece. Desperately, she ran her hands over every inch of its surface. On the underside of the lid, where the heavy chest was secured with iron hinges, she found it. A small, loose screw, its head partially stripped. With the tiny brass pin from her mother's locket, she began to pry at the screw head. The silence of the room, broken only by the low mechanical drone of the lullaby, made the small scratch of the metal on metal sound deafening. Adrenaline masked the sharp pain in her fingers. Finally, with a soft tink, the screw came loose. She jammed the pin itself under the lid where the hinge met the wood and pulled with all her strength. The old wood groaned in protest. Just then, the rhythmic thrumming of the lullaby abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was terrifying, the absolute stillness before a catastrophic event. Ilara heard the familiar click of the lock turning in the door. They were coming. Driven by a sheer terror of being caught awake and moving, she shoved the loose pin into the deep pocket of her shift and slammed the chest lid shut. She scrambled back onto the cot and covered herself with the thin, rough blanket, closing her eyes and attempting to mimic the deep, tonic-induced stupor they expected. Elder Thomas and Elder Davies entered, their figures silhouetted by the dim light of the lantern they carried. They moved with the silent, practiced efficiency of men who performed this ritual every night. Elder Davies approached the cot, holding the long, thin needle. He examined her face closely, his eyes sharp and assessing. Ilara held her breath, willing her heart to slow, a desperate internal act of psychological camouflage. He reached out and pinched the flesh of her arm, testing the reaction. She made a faint, muffled sound, but did not flinch, allowing her body to remain slack and unresponsive. "She is deep in the lullaby's hold," Elder Thomas confirmed, his voice a low hum. "The starvation has made her more receptive." They didn't realize they were speaking to a fully conscious woman. They wheeled the cart closer. As Elder Davies prepared the needle, Ilara risked a minute, barely perceptible movement, tensing her muscles, preparing to fight. The question was not if she would be sampled, but how she could use the surprise of her mobility to escape the room and find the truth. The final, Terrifying confrontation was moments away, and the terrifying irony was that the Elder's own hubris in relying on a chemical crutch was now her single, desperate chance for survival. The Elder's touch was cold, clinical, and predatory. The tip of the needle, long, stainless, and glinting under the lamp's light, was pressed against the thickest part of her thigh. In a state of drug-induced stupor, Elara would have simply endured the pinprick and the long, slow, viscous draw of the syringe. But she was awake. The moment Elder Davies applied the necessary pressure to break the skin, a shock of pain, sharp and immediate, served as her catalyst. Elara's eyes snapped open. She didn't scream. She roared, a ragged, guttural sound born of weeks of fear and starvation. With a convulsive, desperate burst of adrenaline, she simultaneously kicked out with her heel and lashed out with a stiff, outstretched hand. The kick connected with the glass syringe in Elder Davies's hand, sending it spinning across the room to shatter against the stone wall with a loud, sickening smash. The glass fragments and the yellowish, viscous substance splattered the wall like macabre, abstract art. The slap was weaker, fueled by a malnourished body, but it caught Elder Thomas by surprise, knocking his spectacles from his face. They fell to the floor and broke with a fragile final clink. The moment of shock was her only advantage. She rolled off the cot, landing heavily on the cold wood floor, and scrambled away from the two men, who were momentarily stunned by her unexpected resistance. "The tonic! The tea!" Elder Davies roared, his previous calm shattered, his face a mask of furious, terrified betrayal. She didn't drink the tonic. Elder Thomas, now half-blind and enraged, lunged for her. He was surprisingly strong, fueled by a lifetime of fanatical zeal. He grabbed her ankle, but Elara used the bulk of her body, the very affliction they sought to purge, as a dead weight, tearing her leg free and pulling herself toward the locked door. She knows. She knows about the harvest. Elder Davies yelled, abandoning all pretense of piety and reaching for the key hanging from a hook by the lamp. Elara knew she couldn't beat them physically. She needed to escape the room, reach the chamber of silence, and arm herself with knowledge or a weapon. She lunged for the door, but Elder Thomas intercepted her, pushing her back against the whitewashed wall with surprising force. He pinned her, his breath hot and rancid in her face. "You will not defy the word of God. You will be purified. We gave you every opportunity." Elara saw her chance. Her hand found the rough wooden wall behind his back, and her fingers found the scroll, the message left by the previous occupant that had warned her. "Lydia! Martha! Sarah!" Elara screamed, naming the dead, hoping the shock would give her a fraction of a second. "You killed them. You drained them." The words had the desired effect. Elder Thomas froze, his eyes widening in panic. The names were the ultimate sign of her knowledge, the proof that the sanctuary was a sham. In that split second, Elara brought her knee up with a desperate force, catching him in the abdomen. He staggered back, clutching himself, his breath escaping in a wheezing gasp. She did not head for the main door. She pivoted and, with a terrifying decisiveness, ran toward the wall separating her room from the chamber of silence. She hurled her shoulder into the thin lath and plaster, the wood protesting with a cracking sound, but it held. Elder Davies, retrieving the keys, stared at the splattered yellowish fat on the wall, the evidence, and made a fateful, panicked decision. He grabbed a heavy bronze candlestick from the table. "Stop, you harlot!" he shrieked, the sound shocking and animalistic. Elara ignored him. She looked down at the wall and saw the small, loose screw she had pried from the chest. She grabbed it and, with a desperate strength, jammed it deep into the wall near the original faint scroll. She scraped it along the plaster, carving a quick, jagged line of her own message. The light was dim, but her hand was steady, fueled by pure adrenaline. She scrawled a single, terrifying word intended for the next victim, or perhaps a curious cleaner: oil. The elders were upon her. Elder Davies raised the heavy candlestick. Ilara spun around, bracing herself for the blow, but before the candlestick could connect, she saw a new movement. A shadow in the hallway near the far staircase. A third figure. A younger man, slight of build, standing perfectly still, watching the violent, horrifying scene unfold. He was dressed in the severe, plain clothing of the sanctuary staff, but his eyes were wide, filled not with the elder's fanaticism, but with sheer, petrified horror. It was Silas, the silent driver who had brought her to the sanctuary, the man who knew the roads in and out. The candlestick descended, a black blur aimed at her head. Clang. The blow missed Ilara, deflected by Elder Thomas, who, in his rage, had tried to intercept Elder Davis's reckless attack, afraid the noise and violence would attract unwanted attention from the world outside. They were now wrestling, two men of God, locked in a desperate, silent, violent struggle over the control of their human deposit. Ilara didn't hesitate. Her survival instinct was absolute. She dashed past the brawling elders and flung herself at the main door, fumbling for the lock. She glanced back one last time. Elder Davies had just regained the advantage, bringing the heavy brass candlestick down hard on Elder Thomas's head with a sickening crunch. The older elder collapsed, a black stain blooming instantly on the whitewashed floor, his body mixing with the golden harvested fat. The key was in the lock. Ilara turned it, and the heavy door snicked open. She pulled it wide and stared down the dark, oppressive hallway at the only other witness, Silas. He met her gaze. His face was pale, his lips moving in a silent, desperate plea for help or forgiveness. Ilara's heart hammered the question. Was he an accomplice or a prisoner too? Ilara fled down the dark, echoing hallway, her breathing ragged, her heart feeling ready to burst through her chest. The heavy metallic stench, now undeniably blood and rendered human fat, was overwhelming. The sight of Elder Thomas's still, lifeless body and Elder Davies's panicked, murderous face had permanently shattered the religious facade of the Ebenezer sanctuary. She ran toward the front of the house, where she remembered the main hall and the outside door to be. She needed to reach the telephone, a modern marvel that had begun to appear in Boston's wealthier homes, or simply scream loud enough to reach the nearest settlement. But the house was a labyrinth of shadows, designed for isolation. The front doors were reinforced, secured with heavy deadbolt mechanisms and a complexity that required time and clear hands, luxuries she did not possess. She risked a glance behind her. Elder Davies was on his feet, his labored breathing echoing through the hall, his face contorted into a snarl of sheer, undiluted rage and desperation. He couldn't let her escape. The evidence, the bodies, the ledger, the scattered fat, was too damning. The harvest fund was about to be exposed. "Stop, you wretch!" he bellowed, his voice losing all its cultivated religious composure. "You will ruin everything. The consortium will have your blood." He was no longer a man of God. He was a desperate criminal. Ilara ducked into a small, dark side room, a cramped, dusty parlor used for storing obsolete religious texts. She slammed the door shut and jammed a heavy three-legged footstool under the brass handle. It wouldn't hold him for long, but it bought her precious seconds. She pressed her ear to the thin wood. She could hear Elder Davies on the other side, grunting as he threw his full weight against the door. The sound of splintering wood was terrifyingly close. She desperately scanned the room for a means of escape. Her gaze landed on a figure in the corner, shrouded in shadow. It was Silas, the silent driver, who had been an observer to the entire horrific scene. He had followed her. He was standing against the wall, clutching a small, leather-bound book to his chest, his eyes wide, his body shaking. He looked less like a guard and more like a terrified servant who had stumbled into a murder scene. "The elders, they didn't tell me," he whispered, his voice a reedy, choked sound. "They said it was penance. They said it was for the good work." Ilara stepped closer, her hand extended, a desperate plea for a shared humanity. "Silas," The green tea paralyzed me. They were killing us. They were mining our bodies for oil. You saw what he did to Elder Thomas. You have to help me. Silas's eyes darted nervously between Ilara and the rattling door. The stool was giving way. I know a way out, he stammered, his mind reeling from the violence and the terrifying reveal. The coal chute. It leads to the boiler room. It's an old escape route, from before the church bought the property. He pointed to a small, low-access door, barely big enough for a body, hidden behind a large, moth-eaten tapestry of a biblical scene. Ilara knew she had to take the chance. She ran to the tapestry, ripping it from the wall. The sound was loud, masking the final crack of the splintering wood as Elder Davies broke into the room. "The coal chute!" she yelled, scrambling toward the small, dark opening. Elder Davies was in the room, his eyes fixed on Ilara, his face glistening with sweat and maniacal focus. He was holding the heavy candlestick again. Silas, with a sudden, surprising act of courageous defiance, stepped directly into the elder's path. "No more, Elder Davies," Silas said, his voice surprisingly firm, though trembling. "I will not be part of this wickedness." The elder, in his blind rage, barely registered the intervention. He simply swung the candlestick in a wide, vicious arc. Thwack! The sound of the impact was sickeningly dull. Silas collapsed without a sound, his body a crumpled form on the floor, the small leather-bound book falling from his grasp. Ilara didn't look back. She slipped headfirst into the dark, narrow opening of the chute. The dust and grime of years coated her clothes, the air thick with the smell of old soot. She pushed, scraped, and clawed her way forward, the sound of Elder Davies's enraged breathing and the frantic movements of his heavy boots echoing above her, urging her on. She tumbled out onto a cold dirt floor. She was in the boiler room, a subterranean chamber filled with the overwhelming oily smell of kerosene and unlabeled chemicals. The single massive coal-fed boiler hummed with a low, intense heat. And then she saw it. Arranged on a long makeshift workbench was the harvesting apparatus. It wasn't supernatural or mystical. It was brutally, terrifyingly mechanical. It was a primitive oil refining still, crudely assembled from copper tubing, glass coils, and a series of unmarked metal drums. The heat from the boiler was channeled to a massive steel pot, the straining apparatus Elder Thomas had mentioned. And on a nearby table, rows upon rows of the glass vials, the nightly samples, were neatly arranged, awaiting the final terrifying process of extraction and purification. Ilara finally understood the full, profane horror. The elders, operating under the guise of religious penance and spiritual purification, were rendering human fat into a highly concentrated, premium-grade industrial oil, a biological lubricant or fuel that likely fetched an astronomical price in the industrializing world of 1879 Boston. They were using the most vulnerable members of their congregation to fund their consortium of saints, their sin of gluttony merely a profitable supply chain advantage. The terror was not in a ghost or a devil, but in the limitless capacity for cruelty and greed in the name of God and progress. The boiler room was Ilara's final desperate battlefield. The oppressive heat, the dizzying smell of volatile chemicals, and the mechanical thrum of the harvesting apparatus formed a sensory nightmare. She was surrounded by the horrifying evidence of the elder's crime, the physical proof of human rendering. Her eyes, now hardened by shock and an icy resolve, scanned the room. The only exit was a heavy, rusted metal door leading to the outside grounds, a door that was secured by a single, massive padlock. The sound of Elder Davies's frantic, heavy steps above her, searching for the coal chute, snapped her into action. She had to find a way to open the lock or destroy the harvest before she was discovered. Her gaze fell on the workbench. Among the glass coils and copper tubing, she noticed a collection of tools, wrenches, hammers, and a small, heavy bottle of clear liquid, labeled only with the word catalyst. This was the substance Elder Thomas had whispered about, the fluid used to aid the extraction, the highly prized secret ingredient that made the rendered fat a superior industrial product. Ilara grabbed the hammer, heavy and cold in her shaking hand, and moved to the locked door. The padlock was thick, its iron hardened. She struck it once, twice, the metal clang echoing deafeningly in the confined space. The lock barely scratched. She looked back at the chute opening. A cloud of black dust and soot indicated that Elder Davies was now inside the narrow passage, moving toward the bottom. She had seconds. Driven by a surge of pure, vengeful energy, Ilara abandoned the lock and moved toward the harvesting apparatus. If she couldn't escape, she would burn the entire operation to the ground, ensuring no other woman would become a deposit for their wicked fund. She found a large metal drum beside the boiler. It was filled with the newly purified, golden yellow oil, the final concentrated product of the Elder's gruesome process. She grabbed a nearby length of hose and began siphoning the thick, precious liquid onto the dirt floor, aiming the stream at the base of the massive coal boiler. The odor of the oil was powerful and distinct, a rich, fatty smell mixed with the faint, unsettling scent of humanity. It was horrifyingly effective, a high-grade fuel ready for ignition. As the oil pooled, Ilara snatched the bottle of catalyst. She knew that to accelerate the fire and ensure total destruction, she needed to introduce this volatile agent. She emptied the contents of the small bottle directly onto the slick, oily patch of floor. The clear liquid dissolved instantly into the yellow fat, the volatile vapors rising quickly toward the ceiling. She heard a grating, terrifying sound. Elder Davies had reached the bottom of the coal chute. He was standing, brushing the soot from his vestments, his eyes immediately falling on Ilara, the pooling oil, and the hammer in her hand. "No!" he shrieked, a sound of sheer financial and moral collapse. "The harvest. You cannot destroy the consortium's future." He lunged for her, abandoning the pretense of the heavy candlestick and relying on the brute force of a panicked man. Ilara moved with a speed born of desperation. She didn't try to run. Instead, she spun around the workbench, grabbing a small, rusted can of kerosene, the standard fuel for the lamps upstairs, and soaked a strip of old rag she found beneath the bench. Elder Davies reached for her, his hand grasping the back of her shift. The fabric tore with a loud ripping sound. Ilara, however, was already moving toward the immense roaring heat of the coal boiler. "I will not be your oil, Elder," she hissed, her voice a low, fierce whisper that held the weight of all the victims. "I will be your fire." She tossed the kerosene-soaked rag onto the glowing white-hot coals of the open boiler door. The dry fabric ignited instantly, a small, controlled flame. Then, she used the hammer to shatter the glass of a small gauge on the side of the boiler, releasing a hiss of pressurized steam. The burning rag, now a small torch, was immediately snatched up. With a final, desperate act, Ilara hurled the blazing rag onto the growing puddle of the highly volatile, catalyst-laced human oil at the base of the boiler. The ignition was instantaneous and catastrophic. Whoosh! A monstrous tongue of yellow-green flame roared across the floor of the boiler room, fueled by the highly potent biofuel. The heat was immediate and unbearable. The fire separated Ilara from the main refining apparatus, creating a wall of heat and smoke. Elder Davies screamed, a short, high-pitched cry that ended abruptly as he was enveloped by the blaze, his body momentarily illuminated by the sickening, bright yellow-green fire of his own creation. Ilara pressed herself against the cold outer wall, her lungs screaming for air. The smoke was blinding, the roar of the fire was deafening. The massive, thick padlock on the outside door was now her only escape. The flames were licking at the roof of the chamber, threatening to consume the entire sanctuary. She knew the elders had planned for maximum efficiency, creating a product that burned too fiercely. With the hammer still clutched in her hand, she repeatedly slammed it against the thick, rusted metal door. not against the lock, but against the door itself, trying to create a weak spot. Bang, bang, bang. Each hit was a desperate percussive plea for survival. Finally, the iron door, weakened by age and the intense localized heat of the fire, buckled. Ilara hurled her weight against it, kicking and pushing until the heavy door groaned and, with a shower of rusted debris, ripped free from the stone frame, leaving a jagged metal-edged opening into the cold, damp Boston night. She crawled out, gasping for the freezing air, her skin scorched, her shift torn. Behind her, the Ebenezer sanctuary was already beginning to glow with the terrifying, unnatural light of the human oil fire. Ilara stumbled out into the frigid Brookline woods, her bare feet sinking into the icy mud and snow. The scene behind her was a roaring inferno. The Ebenezer sanctuary, that cold, stone monument to greed and hypocrisy, was being consumed by the very harvest it had so brutally produced. The yellow-green hue of the flames, the telltale color of the volatile, human-derived oil, was visible for miles, a horrifying beacon of the Elder's dark secret. She was not alone. Lying huddled beneath the shadow of a large oak tree, miraculously having crawled out through a ventilation shaft, was Silas. He was severely wounded, bleeding profusely from a deep cut to his head, but he was alive. The small, leather-bound book he had been clutching was tucked into his jacket. "Silas, are you hurt badly?" Ilara knelt beside him, the heat radiating from the burning sanctuary, a bizarre comfort against the winter cold. He looked up at her, his eyes clouded with pain and shock. "The Elder, he struck me, but I saw the fire. It is finished." He coughed, a rattling, painful sound. "I couldn't let them get away with it, not after. I drove Sarah T. out here. I saw her when she was brought in. She was so terrified." Ilara gently pulled the leather-bound book from his jacket. "What is this, Silas?" "It is the transport ledger," he whispered, his voice fading. "It details every deposit that was moved. The consortium, the buyers. They used me to take the refined oil to the drop points in the city. Industrial factories, the new light companies. They thought it was high-grade whale oil." He coughed again, the effort clearly agonizing. "It is the proof. My penance." He had risked his life to save the only evidence that could expose the powerful network behind the sanctuary. The transport ledger contained the addresses and names of the Elder's silent partners, the businessmen and industrialists of Boston who were knowingly or unknowingly profiting from rendered human fat. Ilara knew she couldn't carry Silas far. The roads were too long and her own strength was failing, but the fire was a massive, uncontrollable emergency. In 1879, a blaze of that magnitude, especially in a property owned by the prominent Calvary Covenant Church, would inevitably draw the attention of the city's fire brigade and the constabulary. "We need help, Silas," Ilara said, trying to staunch the blood flow with a scrap of her torn shift. "We need to get to the main road." Suddenly, the night air was shattered by the distant, urgent clang of a fire bell, the alarm being raised from a faraway church tower, a grim sound that signaled the beginning of the end. Soon, the galloping hooves of the fire brigade's horses would be on the road. As the first faint sound of the arriving fire wagon reached them, Ilara knew the danger wasn't over. If Elder Davies had somehow survived the initial conflagration, he would undoubtedly come after them to destroy the transport ledger. More crucially, the consortium itself, a powerful, wealthy cabal of Boston's elite, would attempt to suppress the truth. The fire was an immediate, terrifying threat, but the political and social power of the conspiracy was the real danger. She took the transport ledger and tucked it securely into the remnants of her dress. "Silas, you stay here. They're coming. I need to make sure they find you first," she instructed, her voice steady and resolute. She kissed his forehead, a small, solemn act of thanks and solidarity. Then, gathering her last reserves of strength, she stumbled into the trees, pushing herself back toward the main road, away from the immediate chaos of the fire. She needed to be the messenger, the one to present the ledger to the authorities, not as a crazed victim, but as a credible witness who had narrowly escaped a horrific crime. She was running on sheer willpower and a desperate need for justice. The physical exhaustion was a deep, paralyzing ache, but the memory of the dead, Lydia, Martha, and Sarah, and the cold, clinical horror of the harvesting apparatus drove her forward. She was no longer running from the fire. She was running to the law, to the promise of a future where her body was her own, not a deposit to be mined by ruthless men. The journey was a blur of mud and ice. Finally, she broke free of the trees, collapsing onto the rough, frozen dirt of the main road, just as the first Boston Fire Brigade wagon, pulled by a team of steaming horses, roared past, heading straight for the glowing inferno of the Ebenezer Sanctuary. Ilara raised a feeble hand. The transport ledger clutched tight. The wagon was gone, but another vehicle was following it. A small, dark carriage, the emblem of the Boston Constabulary faintly visible on its side, heading to investigate the massive fire. She pushed herself up, staggering into the middle of the road, her torn clothes, her scorched skin, and her terrified eyes a shocking image against the dark night. She was the proof the city needed. The living, breathing evidence of the nightmare. The final chapter began not with a roar, but with a frigid clinical interrogation in the sparse, oak-paneled headquarters of the Boston Constabulary. Ilara, wrapped in a thick, rough wool blanket, was a shocking figure of survival. A woman who had been starved, tormented, and nearly rendered, now facing the skeptical, sharp scrutiny of Captain Henry Lowell, a grizzled veteran of the Boston police force, famous for his cynical pragmatism. Lowell listened, occasionally glancing at the transport ledger that lay open on his desk, the definitive, meticulous proof provided by Silas. The ledger detailed the financial transactions, the code names of the consortium members, and the exact drop-off points of the refined human oil, factories, lamp manufacturers, and the offices of Elias Thornwood, her own father. An industrial oil refined from human fat, Miss Thornwood, and all under the cover of a religious sanctuary. Captain Lowell leaned back, his skepticism evident. It's an unbelievable claim, a delusion brought on by starvation and trauma. Ilara met his gaze, her eyes clear and unwavering. Her voice, though a mere rasp, was fueled by absolute certainty. The fire, Captain. The fire is not delusion. It is the proof. The flames are yellow-green. They are the color of a substance that burns with unnatural ferocity, a product of their catalyst. She paused, allowing the weight of the moment to settle. And the sanctuary is not the only source. The ledger proves it. My father, Elias Thornwood, supplied the primary deposit. He handed me over to be mined for his share of the harvest fund. The revelation that Elias Thornwood, a man of impeccable standing, was directly implicated provided the necessary shock. Lowell ordered a team to search the remains of the Ebenezer Sanctuary. Within the hour, the confirmation came. The search team found Elder Davies, severely burned but miraculously alive, having stumbled from the inferno and collapsed in the woods. They also found the grisly, untouched remains of the harvesting apparatus, the metal vat and the glass coils, now warped but undeniable. And most damningly, the Ebenezer ledger in the rubble, with its clinical notations of deposit and wasting sickness. The final horrifying piece of evidence was the gruesome discovery of the remains of Elder Thomas, his death clearly caused by blunt force trauma, not the fire. The case against Elder Davies, and, through the transport ledger, against Elias Thornwood, was overwhelming. Elder Davies, a man of profound moral corruption and cold scientific ruthlessness, was arrested. Under grueling interrogation, the full, sickening scope of the operation was revealed. The obese women of the congregation were the most accessible and profitable resource, their bodies a source of a superior stable oil, a high-grade lubricant that the elders, using the secrecy of the church, had secretly developed and patented. The waking lullaby was a form of hypnotic suggestion combined with a paralyzing agent, making the extraction process easier, and the pinpricks were merely the entry points for the large, specialized needles used to draw the liquefied fat. The consortium consisted of wealthy businessmen who invested in the Harvest Fund, believing the profits came from an anonymously sourced, cheap and excellent new kind of whale oil substitute. Elias Thornwood was arrested at his home on Beacon Hill. He initially maintained his innocence, claiming he had only sought spiritual correction for his daughter's affliction. However, the police found thousands of dollars in a hidden compartment of his safe, funds directly traceable to the Harvest Fund. Faced with the ledger and the impending scandal, Elias broke, confessing his terrible hypocrisy. He had knowingly provided the elders with a steady stream of excessive individuals, including his own wife's cousin, Sarah T., in exchange for a stake in the lucrative venture. He had sacrificed his daughter to save his own financial reputation, concealing his greed beneath a rigid mask of piety. Silas, despite his injuries, became the chief witness, his testimony sealing the fate of the elders and the powerful industrialists in the consortium. He was hailed as a hero for his courage. The trial, a massive media spectacle in the autumn of 1879, shocked Boston to its core. It exposed the dark underbelly of the Gilded Age, the profound hypocrisy, the exploitation of the poor and vulnerable, and the cold, inhuman ruthlessness of profit-driven industrialization. The case was a brutal judgment on a society that prioritized wealth and moral appearances over human life. Elara Thornwood was the living testimony. She testified with a quiet strength that transcended her traumatic past. She spoke of the psychological terror, the isolation, the starvation, and the profound violation of her body, and the horrifying, non-supernatural truth of the human rendering operation. Her courage and the sheer audacity of the elders' crime ensured their swift conviction. Elder Davies was sentenced to life in prison, and Elias Thornwood, stripped of his fortune and reputation, was sentenced to a long term for accessory to murder and conspiracy. The scandal was a moral earthquake. Elara left Boston, using a small inheritance left by her mother, to start a new life in the burgeoning, more liberal city of Chicago. She was physically scarred and forever changed, but she had achieved a profound, life-altering victory. She had not only survived the harvest, but she had also exposed the brutal truth of the consortium, choosing justice over silence. The weight that fell from Elara's shoulders was not the weight of her flesh, but the weight of her father's judgment and the crushing expectations of a cruel society. The scars remained, a permanent mark of her ordeal, but they were no longer a sign of affliction. They were the indelible proof of her survival. Elara was finally free, her body her own, her voice the ultimate weapon against the darkness. The terror of the sanctuary was over, but the chilling realization of what humans were capable of doing to one another under the veneer of piety and progress would remain with the city of Boston and with Elara forever.